Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Sunday, 17 September. It will be cloudy with highs of 11 degrees Celsius or 51 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:29 a.m. and sunset at 7:03 p.m. We are on the 48th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and I hear that the Home Army can't make contact with the Soviets. Are we really surprised by this?
No, Philippe, you're right. We are not surprised that the insurgents can't make contact with the Soviet command. But on the other hand, what is happening was quite a repetitive thing here, really. So the whole of Warsaw is more or less being bombed, really. Insurgents are holding positions in the midtown, so in Śródmieście. And on this night, another group of soldiers from Berling's army attempt to try and cross the river. There is an interesting situational report from Antoni Chruściel, so the commander of the Warsaw Uprising. I quote, "There were heavy fights with the enemy from the 13th. Over the past 3 days, our losses are about 100 killed and 300 wounded, and practically all of the officers have been killed. Czerniaków can be compared to the Old Town." So if you remember back from the Old Town, the devastation and how much it was constantly being targeted and the destruction of all the buildings and people having to evacuate, this is the situation that is happening in the district of Czerniaków. So it is a repetitive thing. Even though Powiśle fell very quickly, Czerniaków is still holding strong, even though it's been under attack for the past 2.5 weeks. So it is comparable to the Old Town. If we lose, we will lose access to the river Vistula. And we still haven't made contact with the Soviet command. Now, the district of Czerniaków will cut them off completely, which means that the Soviets will not be able to land and help. I say this in quotation marks because it doesn't really happen that much. That the Soviets can't land and help the insurgents during the Warsaw Uprising. They also lose access to drinking water, for example, because you've got to remember that drinking water is practically non-existent. Also, the insurgents are losing access to water to be able to put out fires. They're not able to put out any fires during bombings or intentional setting of fire by the Germans. So this becomes very, very problematic for the insurgents. There's also a note from the deputy Polish Prime Minister to the Polish Prime Minister, quote, "Soviet airdrops are negligible. There is a lack of Allied airdrops. We don't know what to think about this. This is terrible treatment of us." The Poles, their morale over the past weeks have been completely and utterly destroyed. The insurgents are desperate for Allied help. We've got to remember what is happening today on this day on the Western Front, Arnhem. So unfortunately, the Allies are concentrating their firepower, their air power, and everything is now moving towards the liberation of Arnhem. And the Poles have become a little bit of an afterthought. There are no Allied airdrops on this day, and the insurgents are begging and desperate. They have no ammunition, they have no weapons, they have no food, they have no medical supplies. They are desperate, and all they see now is defeat on the horizon, and the uprising is still going to last another 2.5 weeks. The other thing I wanted to mention before I finish is the bombing of very specific places by the Germans, and that is a load of streets I'm not going to name out because nobody's going to know where they are, but Krucza Street is one of the ones that I want to concentrate on. And why? Well, it's on this day, during a bombing of Krucza Street, 2 messengers are killed in the bombing, Alina and Irena Grotowska. As you can tell, they're sisters. Not only are they sisters, they're twins. 2 messengers killed in one bombing. And during the occupation, they provided assistance to families of people who were arrested or executed, especially orphan children, because that did happen, where children would have both their parents either executed, deported, and they would be left by themselves. And sometimes they would themselves even end up in a concentration camp. Their younger brother also died during the uprising on the 28th of August in the Old Town after his headquarters were bombed. And the 2 sisters are buried together with their mother in Powązki Military Cemetery. This is another prime example of whole generational lines being completely and utterly extinct. You're looking at 3 siblings who lose their lives in the matter of 2 weeks. So moving on, there's a lot happening. We haven't spoken about Pruszków in a couple of days, and something very interesting happens on this day in Pruszków. And Claire, tell us, where are we with this? Where are we with Pruszków? What is happening there? Why is today so important?
Well, we get quite an interesting event on the 17th of September. It's actually the Red Cross are brought in to assess the Pruszków transit camp. So this is the camp, it was on an old railway sidings actually, and it was where the people who were taken, the civilians coming out of Warsaw, were taken as a sort of transit camp before they were sent further west, as the Germans put it. And the Germans, I think it's pretty clear now that the Germans, they know that they're going to be leaving Warsaw. And what they're trying to do here is to present some sort of a positive view of the camp, to put them in a slightly better light. So they invite a delegate from the Swiss Red Cross, it's Dr. Paul Wiss. And obviously they do quite a lot of preparation for him. We've seen this sort of work happening previously in the concentration camps. We know there were so-called model concentration camps that Red Cross delegates were invited to visit, where some of the healthier families, maybe the newer people who'd been trained in, were put in a sort of separate enclosure. They were given better accommodation, more food, educational facilities. There was even play equipment for children. And then when the Red Cross had finished their visiting, these people were just put back in the main camp or just sent straight off, essentially to their deaths. And this is a similar sort of thing happening here at the Pruszków transit camp. It's not a concentration camp, but the conditions were absolutely horrendous. And it's worth looking at the doctor's report, both to get a picture of what the camp was like, but also to see what they were doing to hoodwink him and to present this in the best possible conditions, because we know that during his stay, they arranged for shipments from a welfare council to come, including food like canned condensed milk, tinned sardines and medicines and so on, all in preparation for him to write his Red Cross report. So here's a couple of extracts from that report. It's interesting that he starts off, his first paragraph just details when he arrives, the date and so on. But then he says, his second point is, I'm pleased that Dr. Jans, whose task was to facilitate my work, fulfilled the role entrusted to him with great tact and dedication. So that is immediately going in to sort of thank his hosts, in this case the Germans, for inviting him in and for giving him such good support. It's a very detailed report, but he makes a lot of interesting points. First of all, he notes that as soon as they arrive at the camp, all the men between the ages of 16 and 60 are immediately separated from everyone else, and those who can work are sent to Germany for work there. But then he says that those who are unfit to work for whatever reason, health or age, are evacuated to various areas around Warsaw and Radom, it's another Polish city. He says they remain free there and find shelter either with their family or with the local population, and they can work if they wish, which he doesn't give any evidence for this. We don't know if he is just purely taking his German host's word for this, or if he's speaking to members of the Polish community who are held in that camp. If he is, they are not speaking freely. They're not able to give a fair and free feedback to him. And then describing the conditions of the camp as well, he says, in the main hall, it can accommodate up to 8,000 people at any one time. So that gives you a bit of an indication of how many people are going through, because most of these people are passing through within a couple of weeks. The doctor says that those who occupy this hall have neither beds nor bunks nor straw, which he decides is right. It's probably better that way, because constantly changing, cleaning the halls would be impossible, he thinks. And most of these people have come from weeks in the basements in Warsaw, and their bodies are covered with vermin. So he thinks that hygienic conditions would be absolutely impossible to maintain and would deteriorate immediately. So he thinks that that's fair enough. But he does note that although the nights are now getting colder, it's mid-September, so it's not that warm. A surprising number of the people at the camp are actually choosing to sleep outside under the stars. There is in any case no heating, he notes, but he says that Colonel Sieber tells me this will be installed in a few days. There's no account of him returning to check up on this. There is no covering provided for them. The people cover themselves with rags. The Germans say they are unable to provide covers. He notes that the adults and children are both given 3 meals a day, including a portion of soup consisting of vegetables and potatoes, although he admits there is never fat or meat. Mostly it seems to be bread and coffee without sugar. But nonetheless, if this was true, this would be significant amounts, which it's unlikely the German military would have had available. And if they had, they wouldn't have been sharing it like this. He even notes that the children's menu includes a portion of soup with cream. Clothing, obviously appalling. These people have come from the Warsaw Uprising that started in the summer. Most of them are in the ragged remains of summer dresses or light shirts. And the doctor describes the children. He says they are all in rags in a terribly sad situation. They are cold and cuddle up with their mothers. And there are also tiny children, those who were born at the moment of tragedy, at the moment of escape or arrival at the camp. and these children are naked, wrapped just in disgusting rags. Medical facilities, unsurprisingly, he says the work of the doctors is very complicated. Obviously, there's a whole lot of need for them. There's a massive shortage of the necessary medicines. He says the surgery has almost no surgical tools or no appropriate materials for dressing dangerous wounds. Everything remains in Warsaw, much of which is burning. There are 16 permanent doctors in the camp. These are largely taken from the Polish population themselves. There's also a Russian dentist in there who are being used, but they don't have any facilities. But he notes here, in fact, it can be said there is not a single sick person in the camp, apart from a very few slightly injured. But that's not because they haven't arrived. It's just because they are immediately evacuated to fortified field hospitals located in a radius of approximately 30 kilometres from the camp. But again, he doesn't visit these field hospitals, and there is no evidence of them. So it seems that he's probably correct that the sick were quickly moved out of the camp, but probably just sent to concentration camps, if that. So that gives a pretty clear picture of what's happening. I mean, the upside, he does note that 61 boxes of medicine arrived from Geneva on this day, but then qualifies that by saying everything on the attached list is missing. So that gives a picture of the camp. So this is when the Germans are sending out leaflets or making calls to the population of Poland saying, come out with white rags, come out and surrender to us and we will look after you, and food and medicine will be given. That gives a pretty clear picture of the reality of the situation, even when it's filtered through the report of this doctor from the Swiss Red Cross who's been given the most favourable impression possible.
I just want to also add that even though Weiss wrote a report that is more or less positive from the perspective of the Germans, I want to show you Irena Oborska, her memory of what it was actually like, the true horror of Pruszków camp.
I remember our fate more or less clearly. A huge crowd of people, classified during the selection as the stronger and younger, were loaded into cattle wagons. We were transported in terrible crowds, in horrible conditions, without food and access to a toilet. Many people had stomach problems, so this lack of toilets made the journey even more difficult. We met a group of friends in the wagon, and we shared the remains of our food, but everyone lacked water. Maybe the Germans brought us something to drink from time to time. I can't say. We had been travelling for a long time in an unknown direction, maybe to work, or maybe to a concentration camp.
So the Germans are obviously working quite hard here to present a humanitarian picture of the Pruszków transit camp. But of course, they're not the only ones who are working in the field of propaganda, trying to manipulate the narrative of the Warsaw Uprising as it enters its final phases. Roger, can you talk to us about the Soviet position at this point?
Yeah, there's a nice sort of parallel here, actually, between the Germans and the Soviets, as you say, because they are both, in a sense, the propaganda operation is going into overdrive on both sides to sort of set out their respective stalls. And both of them, interestingly, on this day, make sort of appeals to posterity, as it were. And now, we're kind of accustomed to this. There's the sort of Weasel line that you often hear today about being on the right side of history and that sort of thing. This is the sort of the Nazi and the Soviet equivalent at the time. So there's a report from Radio Moscow which talks about Warsaw, and it says, and I quote, "So when the Red Army entered Praga, i.e. the east of Warsaw, it did not find a single soldier from General Bohr's underground army." And then it says, "Historians will not forget the attempts of the enemies of the United Nations to divide the great allies over the Battle of Warsaw." So again, appealing to posterity, the historians of the future will note this, will remember this. And on the very same day, there's a report in the Nowy Kurier Warszawski, which is Polish language, but it's a German propaganda newspaper, talking about they had a series of articles that sort of reference the rising. So bear in mind, of course, this is German propaganda. And this one article, again published the same day, says, "When the guns fall silent, the roar of the planes, the roar of the bombs and the rattle of rifles fade away. When the smoke of the fires mixed with red brick dust settles, the tragic ruins above, Warsaw will be filled with silence and the peace desired by all. Historians will then come to the fore and present to posterity a faithful picture of the events that led to the suicide of a capital of 1 million people, unknown in the history of the world so far." It goes on to say, "What will historians base their conclusions on after the flames have consumed all of the relevant documents and the eyewitnesses to the tragedy have all been killed?" So again, both of them are using this idea of, how will history look back? How will history judge what's going on today? And I thought that was a lovely parallel that both regimes in their propaganda essentially doing exactly the same thing. One of which is saying, actually, I think the German one is saying, in terms of all of this destruction, what will be left for the historians of the future? It's kind of almost an open question, whereas the Soviet one is saying, the historians of the future are going to damn you if you don't talk about this in the correct manner. But it's really interesting. Both of them are making that appeal to posterity. So I rather liked that parallel.
It's interesting because today, of course, you were talking about the Weasel phrase. I think it's very interesting that we often hear, we can't change history, you can't rewrite history, pulling down statues or whatever. And yet here you get examples of people trying to write history, trying to own that narrative, desperate to have, history judge them correctly, for their story to be the one that goes through. And we are among the many historians who look back now and are looking at all of this. And fortunately also looking at the amount of material that the Poles themselves saved, that incredible amounts of film footage that they took. And there is a lot of documentation among all three of these warring parties, and in fact the British as well.
I think the only thing that the Germans get right in this specific publication on this day is that they are saying that Soviet propaganda is an overdrive, which is true. It's not very wrong. Soviet propaganda is an overdrive, as is German.
Yeah, indeed, and that propaganda material as well. Interestingly, and that I think we often, maybe to some extent, we sort of dismiss these sort of, maybe a newspaper article or whatever is almost as ephemera. It's something that's sort of rather transient, not terribly instructive. But we know different now, and we can look at this stuff in the round. And as you say, both sides desperately trying to create a narrative. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for day 48 on our Warsaw Uprising series, and we will see you tomorrow for day 49. But before we finish, do not forget, if you like us, rate us on your favourite listening platform. All our Apple listeners, get rating. There's not enough ratings on there. And thank you to everybody who's been rating us on Spotify. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.